Dawn broke over the French coastline like a blade of cold light. On a windswept field outside a ruined farmhouse, 7 German soldiers stood in a crooked line, mud splashed up their boots, hands tied behind their backs. They were young, too young for this kind of ending. Some barely shaving, some trembling, some murmuring prayers under their breath. Behind them, a British firing squad assembled in grim silence. These men had marched all night, fought all week, and buried friends only hours before. Their faces were carved with exhaustion, grief, and the hardened stillness that comes from seeing far too much. A lieutenant unfolded a creased paper, reading the charges in a clipped voice. Sabotage. Murder of civilians. Destruction of supply depots. The accusations rippled through the air like winter wind. The Germans stiffened. Some protested. Quietly. Desperately. Others lowered their heads, already accepting the fate history had handed them. And then, in the center of it all, walked a single man. Captain Edward Mallory. Calm. Expression unreadable. A veteran of North Africa, Italy, and too many nights where men disappeared before dawn. He studied the condemned with the eyes of someone who knew what final moments looked like. Everything hinged on him. One order, and 7 lives would end. Another order, and the nature of justice in this small corner of Europe would shift forever. The squad raised rifles. Metal clicked. Breath held. The Germans squeezed their eyes shut. Captain Mallory opened his mouth. And instead of saying, "Fire," he said something no one expected. A sentence that would change the memory of that morning for every man who survived it. The story began long before that morning in France. To understand why Captain Edward Mallory changed the course of 7 men's lives, we have to return to the shifting front lines of late 1944, when the Allies pushed eastward after the breakout from Normandy. Europe was exhausted, burning, fractured. Every village liberated revealed new tragedies, destroyed homes, scattered families, and civilians caught between retreating German units and advancing Allied troops. Mallory's battalion, the 5th Royal Norfolk Regiment, had been moving through a battered region south of Caen. The fighting was scattered but vicious, full of ambushes, collapsing resistance pockets, and desperate rearguard actions by German forces unwilling to yield ground. Rumors traveled faster than orders. Stories of German saboteurs blowing bridges behind them, leaving booby-trapped barns, poisoning wells. Some of those stories were true. Some were inventions of frightened civilians. Some were misunderstandings in the chaos of war. In late September, Mallory's unit reached a small village called Bulge, a place where the wind carried the smell of smoke even when nothing burned. The villagers claimed a German demolition team had passed through the night before, destroying grain stores and killing 2 local men who tried to stop them. They pointed, shaking with rage, toward the nearby woods. By sunrise, British scouts returned with 7 prisoners, disarmed, exhausted, and insisting they had merely been stragglers trying to reach their retreating division. They denied harming civilians. They denied blowing anything up. They denied even carrying explosives. But the villagers were adamant. They wanted justice. They wanted revenge for months of occupation and the 2 bodies lying in the town square beneath coarse blankets. And the British, stretched thin and operating without full intelligence, were under pressure to restore order swiftly. Mallory investigated as much as time allowed. He questioned the Germans, questioned the villagers, inspected the demolished storehouse. The debris suggested explosives were used, but in 1944, every army used the same basic charges. No clear evidence linked the prisoners to the destruction. Yet the locals demanded action. Their grief was raw, loud, immediate. And British command, overwhelmed by the pace of the advance, instructed Mallory to use his discretion. Discretion, in wartime, was a word with many meanings. The battalion's lieutenant believed the safest path was execution. He had lost 2 brothers in the war. Anger shaped his judgment. Some soldiers supported him, convinced that strict measures discouraged sabotage. Others hesitated, uneasy about killing prisoners without absolute certainty. Mallory carried a different kind of weight. He had seen reprisals in North Africa spiral out of control, had witnessed villages punished for crimes committed by a single man. He also knew the rage of civilians wasn't irrational. it was the accumulation of years living under occupation. But justice delivered in anger easily became something else entirely. As dawn approached, Mallory walked the perimeter of the village alone. He passed ruined walls, broken wagons, and the charred remains of what once fed a community. He understood the villagers' grief, yet every time he looked at the prisoners, thin, exhausted, scared, he saw boys trapped in a war they didn't control. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had committed the sabotage and slipped away into the night. These 7 had simply been the ones unfortunate enough to be found. Still, orders required resolution. By sunrise, the prisoners were bound. The squad assembled. Lives hung suspended between accusation and truth. Mallory was the only man who could decide what justice meant that day. As the first pale light crept over Bulge, the tension inside the British camp thickened. Soldiers gathered in uneasy clusters, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. Some sharpened bayonets out of habit, others adjusted straps, others simply stared at the 7 prisoners who sat on the ground with their backs against a crumbled stone wall. None of them looked like the hardened saboteurs the villagers described. They looked like young conscripts who had run out of road. Mallory stood apart from his men, weighing the layers of the situation. The villagers wanted blood. Grief had stripped away caution. The battalion's senior officers, miles away and engaged in more pressing battles, had effectively washed their hands of the matter. His own men were divided, and time was running out. Rumors had spread. The captain was hesitating, the captain was soft, the captain was risking the trust of the locals. The lieutenant, Harris, approached Mallory with impatience thinly disguised as respect. "Sir, we have to act. The villagers won't calm down without a show of justice. And if these men really are saboteurs, letting them go could cost us more lives." Mallory didn't respond immediately. Harris's reasoning wasn't without merit. The Germans had indeed destroyed supply lines on their retreat through France, and sabotage teams often posed as lost soldiers. But Mallory had learned long ago that the truth in war wasn't loud, it was buried beneath fear, grief, and assumption. He returned to the prisoners. One of them, a boy with pale hair and a bruised cheek, looked up at him with a mixture of terror and stubbornness. "Bitte, Herr Hauptmann," he whispered, voice trembling. "We did nothing. We were separated from our unit. We followed the road and your men found us. We did not kill anyone." Mallory studied his face. Fear, yes. But something else, exhaustion that came from running, not from destroying. Another prisoner, older, with the hollow stare of someone who had seen the Eastern Front, spoke up carefully in halting English. "We do not blame villagers for anger. But it was not us. We have no explosives. We have only what your men found, rifles, empty canteens." Mallory knew that intent wasn't enough to clear them. Evidence mattered, and he had none. He turned back toward the ruined grain store. The villagers were gathered around it, their emotions rising. A woman shouted that her husband had been killed trying to defend it. A boy cried that his family now had nothing to eat. The ache in their voices painted a simple story. 7 Germans came through the town, and then destruction followed. But simple stories in war often hid complicated truths. Harris joined the villagers, promising them justice. When he returned, his expression had hardened further. "They won't accept anything less than execution. And sir, they're watching us. If we don't act, they might take matters into their own hands." That was the real threat. A mob's execution was far more brutal, far more chaotic. If Mallory refused to act, the villagers might storm the camp, dragging the prisoners into the square. That would be murder under the guise of justice. And Mallory would bear that failure. He examined the ground near the blast site again. The crater was shallow, the edges sharp. Military grade, definitely, but something about the placement bothered him. Saboteurs usually rigged buildings from inside to ensure maximum collapse. This blast had originated outside, near the southern wall. The structural damage didn't match classic German demolition patterns he had studied. And then Mallory noticed something half buried in dirt, a piece of metal shrapnel, stamped faintly with markings he recognized. British, not German. His pulse quickened. Was it possible the explosion hadn't been caused by the retreating Germans at all, but by abandoned Allied ordnance? Minefields, unexploded shells, artillery leftovers from earlier fighting. The region had been contested territory only weeks before. Stray explosives were everywhere. If word spread that the villagers had blamed Germans for something actually caused by Allied debris, fury would turn into shame, and Mallory's battalion might lose the fragile trust of the region. He pocketed the metal shard. This changed everything, yet it also changed nothing. He had proof the Germans didn't do it, but revealing it would collapse the villagers' narrative, ignite confusion, and possibly provoke anger toward the British instead. Mallory returned to his men. Harris waited, tense. "Sir," Harris insisted, "we need the order." Mallory felt the weight of decades of military doctrine pressing down on him. Justice, discipline, morale, civilian cooperation, all woven together. The simplest action was to give the order Harris wanted. The right action was far more complicated. The prisoners were lined up. The squad raised their rifles. Everyone watched Mallory. And Mallory realized the decision he made now would define more than this morning. It would define what justice meant in a world where truth was always the first casualty. The field fell silent. Every man felt it, the stillness that comes before an irreversible moment. The villagers watched from a distance, gripping each other, whispering curses and prayers. The British soldiers shifted uneasily, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. 7 prisoners stood in a crooked line, backs to the wall of the ruined farmhouse, breathing shallowly, their eyes flickering with terror and resignation. Captain Mallory stepped forward. Lieutenant Harris stiffened, waiting for the single word that would end the debate. The firing squad pressed their rifles into their shoulders. No one moved. No one blinked. Even the wind held its breath. Mallory looked at the 7 Germans, then at the villagers, then back to his own men. He could feel the shape of the decision forming, not from anger, not from pressure, but from the truth he carried in his pocket, the twisted fragment of British ordnance. "Lower your weapons," Mallory said quietly. The words rippled through the ranks like a shock. Harris snapped his head around. "Sir? The order is to carry out sentence." Mallory faced him directly. "The order is to maintain justice, discipline, and the integrity of this battalion. And I will not carry out an execution without certainty." He held up the metal shard. "This came from the blast site. It's ours, not theirs." Harris's face drained of color as he examined the fragment. Confusion collided with disbelief. "But the villagers..." Mallory cut him off. "The villagers are grieving. They want answers, not revenge masquerading as justice. And they will accept the truth if we lead with discipline, not emotion." The firing squad hesitated. Some men lowered their rifles in relief. Others hesitated, unsure whether Mallory's defiance of the villagers would bring more trouble. The tension broke slightly, but only slightly. The prisoners stared at Mallory with wide, stunned eyes. One began to sob quietly, overwhelmed by the realization that they might actually live. Another whispered a rushed prayer of gratitude. For the first time that morning, hope cracked through the despair. Harris stepped closer, voice low but heated. "Sir, with respect. If we release them, the villagers will revolt. They barely trust us. They'll think we're protecting the enemy." "They will accept reason," Mallory replied, "or they will be reminded that we are the authority here." Mallory walked toward the villagers. Harris followed unhappily, and several British soldiers exchanged nervous glances before trailing behind. The villagers surged forward, demanding to know why the rifles had lowered. Mothers cried out that justice was being denied. Men shouted that the British did not understand their suffering. Fear and fury churned together, threatening to boil over. Mallory raised a hand. His voice was steady, cutting through the noise. "I have inspected the site," he began. "The explosion that destroyed your grain store did not come from German charges. It came from an unexploded Allied shell buried near your southern wall. Your men died trying to clear the debris, not fighting saboteurs." A hush spread slowly across the crowd. Faces shifted, from rage, to doubt, to confusion, and then grief of a different kind, the grief of learning that tragedy had not been deliberate, just cruel chance. A woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Another villager stared blankly at the ground. A few muttered protests, unwilling to release their anger so quickly, but the truth had taken root. Mallory continued, firm and calm. Executing these men would not bring your grain back. It would not honor your dead. It would only create another injustice. The villagers gradually softened, exhaustion overtaking fury. Their voices grew quiet. They stepped back, grieving but accepting. Mallory returned to the prisoners. One of them whispered, "Danke, thank you." Mallory didn't reply. He simply nodded to his men. "Untie them," he ordered. "They will be held until transport arrives. They are prisoners, not condemned men." For the first time all morning, the air felt breathable. The sun was higher now, washing the field in pale gold instead of the harsh gray of dawn. The energy that had gripped the battalion slowly dissolved into something quieter, heavier, more reflective. British soldiers released long breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. The 7 Germans, still trembling, were escorted gently, not dragged, toward the temporary holding area. Every step they took was a step they hadn't expected to make. Life for them had resumed in a way that felt unreal. Lieutenant Harris lingered beside Mallory, wrestling with a tangle of emotions. Disagreement still flickered in his eyes, but so did relief. "Sir," he said finally, "I may have pushed for the wrong outcome." Mallory placed a hand on his shoulder. "You pushed for what you believed would keep everyone safe. That's not wrong. But safety isn't always the same as justice." Harris nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. In the village, the crowd dispersed without violence. Grief remained, but the sharp edge of vengeance had dulled. A few villagers approached Mallory, offering quiet apologies for their outbursts. He accepted them without judgment. War had stretched them to breaking. Emotions were as unpredictable as stray shells buried beneath the earth. Later that day, Mallory filed his report. He described the blast site, the evidence, the misunderstanding. But he did not describe the way to the morning, the way fear had nearly rewritten the fate of 7 young men, or the way a village had nearly turned its pain into bloodshed. Those things lived beyond paperwork, in the memories of the men who stood on that field. That evening, as the battalion prepared to move east again, Mallory sat alone near the farmhouse ruins. He thought of the villagers, of the 2 men who had died, of the prisoners who had been moments away from execution. War twisted truth so easily, pushing people toward decisions they would never make in peacetime. He wondered how many other misunderstandings had ended differently. How many men had been shot because no one stopped to question the story being told. Mallory didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a soldier who had chosen caution over certainty, humanity over haste. But in war, those choices were rare, and they mattered far more than anyone could measure. The next morning, the battalion marched onward. The prisoners were transported to a proper camp. The villagers began rebuilding their grain store. And the field where 7 men had prepared to die returned to silence. A silence that held not tragedy, but mercy. A silence that would be remembered long after the war had ended.